Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. Yesterday, Tuesday, in what is a relatively significant development, the so-called Joint Prevention and Control Body of the State Council, China's cabinet, announced that close contacts of COVID-19 infected patients and people entering China from overseas will undergo a shorter quarantine period going forward. The time has been reduced from 14 days of quarantine and another 7 days of home health monitoring to 7 and 3 days respectively, adding that the measure is, quote, not a relaxation of dynamic zero-COVID policy, but is simply aimed at more accurate and scientific prevention, end quote. Whether officially a relaxation or not, this is the first substantial easing of border restrictions since the original Wuhan outbreak back in 2020. At the same press conference yesterday, officials added that the cutting down of this quarantine time is based on studies which suggest the incubation period for Omicron is mostly 2 to 4 days, and that the vast majority of infection cases can be detected within 7 days. Therefore, the new measures will not increase the risk of virus spread. This explanation, of course, is for a domestic audience. This is part of the redefining of dynamic zero-COVID to better incorporate economic considerations which some parts of the leadership have signalled in recent weeks. These are modest changes, but it is leading to hope for some that China may have reached the bottom of major lockdowns, closed borders, and economic shocks. I would argue that it is too early to say. The political system has shown that it will still prioritize zero-COVID above everything else, if necessary. BA5 will eventually get into the mainland, and how the government reacts will let us know and give us an idea of what zero-COVID will look like until the party conference later this year at the earliest. The economic costs of the lockdown have come into sharper focus for policymakers too. China Merchant Securities, in a recent research note, expressed, quote, from the perspective of economic benefits, the lockdown in Shanghai may cause China to lose at least about 1 trillion yuan in gross domestic product this year, end quote. Foreign businesses took the news as a good sign, with modest improvements being better than nothing. Quote, the European Chamber recognizes that China cannot open its borders completely due to relatively low vaccination rates, particularly among those aged 60 and above. This, in conjunction with a slow introduction of mRNA vaccines, means that China may have to maintain a restricted immigration policy beyond the summer of 2023. End quote. Meanwhile, in a continuation of a trend which we have been following since late last week, more Chinese cities have dropped regular COVID testing as concerns regarding the costs grow. The National Health Commission has also advised local governments that testing should be focused on people with high risks of catching the virus or working high-risk jobs and places where outbreaks happen, and that the mass testing of tens of millions of people in cities without cases is a misallocation of public resources. We remember that the annual cost of testing everyone in China's first and second tier cities, approximately 505 million people, could reach as high as $31 billion if PCR tests are done every 3 days at 3.5 yuan apiece, according to estimates by Suzhou Securities Co. Limited. Official new cases across the country are now in the single digits daily. But of course, these are official numbers, and as we discussed yesterday, there are still parts of the country with varying degrees of lockdowns in place. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you appreciate what I'm trying to do with this channel, and you'd like to go the extra mile and help keep this financially sustainable and subscriber supported, my Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, if you want to give a one-off tip, links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Growing anti-China sentiment is a trend we've been seeing in many Asian countries in recent years, including in US ally South Korea. However, now, according to new survey data, Korean attitudes towards the People's Republic of China have hit a new threshold. according to a recent survey by polling company Hancock Research and Korean news magazine Sisaln, Sisaln, some 58% of respondents viewed China as, quote, close to evil, end quote, with only 4.5% of the 1,000 respondents saying China was, quote, close to good, end quote. What is significant is this is one of the first major surveys of South Korean public attitudes where negative views of China were higher than negative views of Japan. If the trend holds, it will be much welcomed by Washington, which has for years now been frustrated in attempts to bring Japan and South Korea, America's most important allies in East Asia, closer together. According to the same survey, South Koreans responded that they favored the United States over China 6-1. South Korean animosity towards Japan is largely due to the latter's colonial legacy, with the former including brutal episodes during the Second World War. While Japan, with the United States and others, helped Korea industrialize and modernize its economy in the decades after the Korean War, these historical scars remain living memories for some older Koreans. However, the survey and others are increasingly indicating that younger generations of Koreans have softening views towards Japan and hardening views towards China. Quote, until now, hating Japan was such a part of Korean national identity. In our survey, people in their 40s and older still dislike Japan more than China. But those in their 20s and 30s, the generation who will lead South Korea in coming decades, tip the scale against China. End quote. South Koreans' backlash against China has been driven by Beijing's response to Seoul's deployment of a US missile defense system in 2017, a dispute which cost South Korea billions of dollars, unofficial bans on K-pop TV shows and a variety of products, accusations of Chinese appropriation of traditional Korean culture, as well as ideological and values differences, especially among young people. Quote, they have grown up in a liberal environment the earlier generations built through sweat and blood, so they hold an inherent antipathy towards illiberal countries. They root for politicians who criticize China. End quote. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who took office just 6 weeks ago, has sent early signals that he intends to mend relations with Japan and take a more critical approach to China. Very much welcome news for Washington. However, South Korea still has large economic vulnerabilities, with China accounting for 1/4 of South Korea's trade. And while South Korean views towards China have hardened in recent years and pro-American sentiment is very high, feelings towards Japan still remain sensitive. South Korea is a thriving liberal democracy and the 12th largest economy in the world. It is a global leader in semiconductor manufacturing and home to the 3rd highest number of US troops outside of the United States, behind Japan and Germany. However the geopolitical situation in East Asia unfolds over the coming decade, South Korea will play a critical role. Okay, let's finish up with the economy. Despite some stabilization, though not recovery, in June, policymakers at the highest levels continue to sound very concerned for the Chinese economy. Premier Li Keqiang visited the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security this week to stress the importance of employment training as official and unofficial youth unemployment numbers continue to frighten officials. Li said that stable employment is a vital sign that the economy is functioning within an appropriate range, and that, quote, the fundamentals for China's recovery are not yet sufficiently solid, and the tasks to stabilize employment remain arduous. End quote. In the dry, bureaucratic language of the State Council, these are deeply concerning words. Li also visited the Ministry of Social Affairs to discuss social insurance policies and stressed the need to, quote, prevent the population from falling back into poverty in large numbers. End quote. A growing chorus of economists are telling the government too that the economy is very damaged on the demand side. Yao Yang, an economist and professor with the National School of Development at Peking University, at a special event last week discussing the economic crisis facing the country, said recent support measures that focused on boosting supply through infrastructure spending likely will not be enough to meet China's 2022 growth target, expressing, quote, right now the policy focus on supply is much bigger than demand. Poor credit demand by companies, uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, and the slump in the property market shows that overall consumption is in a dire state. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode. Thank you so much, everybody. See you tomorrow.